Climate change is probably the most contentious issue in environmental law today. You're probably familiar with the political dynamics at play. In our discussion of mobile sources, we learned that the EPA has the authority to regulate greenhouse gases under the Clean Air Act, and the Obama administration successfully regulated vehicle greenhouse gas emissions. So there's authority to regulate greenhouse gas emissions from mobile sources. But how about stationary sources? My objective in this lecture is to explore how the Clean Air Act can accomplish this goal for stationary sources. Before we dive into the Clean Air Act, we need to recognize the non-Clean Air Act options. There's the option of an international treaty. There have been some well-publicized examples such as the Kyoto Protocol and the Paris Agreement. Another avenue is regional, state, and local efforts, both voluntary and regulatory, such as Virginia's Clean Economy Act. A nuisance lawsuit is another approach. Nuisance lawsuits have been used to restrict neighbors from things that can irritate, and this certainly applies to pollutants. Another approach includes federal voluntary programs like Energy Star that reduce greenhouse gas emissions. Then there's private efforts or personal choices, such as one selection of a renewable energy electricity provider. All of these options exist, but many will require some kind of legal mechanism to effectuate real progress. International treaties will likely require some domestic counterpart legislation to be effective, much like the Montreal Protocol required the Stratospheric Ozone Protection Program. To date, we've yet to achieve the political will to go this route, and many international efforts have faltered. Regional, state, and local efforts can achieve a significant result, as in the California and East Coast greenhouse gas trading programs. There's so much not covered across the country. This piecemeal approach is about the best we have at this time, unfortunately, and represents a lack of leadership at the federal level. Private nuisance claims are alive and well, but as we discussed in our first class, is an approach best suited just for the parties at hand and not for the public welfare. Our first case this week, American Electric Power versus Connecticut, deals with a nuisance claim, so we can explore these issues in our discussion forum. The federal voluntary programs are effective as well, and I've worked on some of these. They bring the government and industry together in a collaborative spirit, but at the end of the day, these are still voluntary and typically only garner the support from entities that are already doing as much as they can to reduce emissions. Of course, private and personal choices are as important as anything else, but like everything else above, they have limited reach when compared to the larger greenhouse gas emission sectors, such as the power sector. There are federal laws on climate change. Many laws were passed between 1992 and 2007. These laws serve as building blocks, but since this output, there hasn't been anything approaching a comprehensive legislative bill. I've assigned an article this week about one major legislative effort we'll discuss later. This brings us to the Clean Air Act. There are many possibilities under this law as identified here. Each one has its pros and cons. I'll briefly review each, provide some background, but I'll be asking you to weigh in on the pros and cons in your blog entry this week. Just to set the stage, this is what transpired after the Massachusetts versus EPA decision in 2007. Obama enters office in 2009, and EPA reconsiders the Bush denial of California's waiver on vehicle emissions and makes an endangerment finding. And once that endangerment finding was made, it triggered other parts of the Act, specifically the stationary source programs such as non-attainment operating permits and the NSPS program, meaning EPA had to get busy writing rules for stationary sources. First up are the National Ambient Air Quality Standards. This would be a logical place to start because EPA has found greenhouse gases to cause or contribute to air pollution which may reasonably be anticipated to endanger public health or welfare. EPA could then take the next step and develop air quality criteria to list greenhouse gases. As you may recall, this is a health-based determination using the latest science criteria to identify a safe concentration of a pollutant in the ambient air. You may also recall that this was done for the other pollutants, such as particulate matter. I want you to consider how one would establish a safe level of greenhouse gases in the air. We'll explore this in the blog. Next up are the New Source Performance Standards, which was the legal authority used in both the Obama and Trump administration plans. As you may recall, NSPS applies to new or modified sources that are part of a specific industrial category, such as coal-fired power plants. And EPA can certainly establish emission standards on greenhouse gases for new and modified plants, but there are no new coal-powered plants being built today in the United States. So the problem is the large number of existing plants. The NSPS program has a unique mechanism that allows it to be applied to existing sources. If the existing source meets these three conditions, then NSPS can be used. The first and second condition requires that the pollutant is not already on the list of criteria pollutants. That would easily be satisfied for greenhouse gases. The third condition is that the pollutant is not already on the list for hazardous air pollutants. In the original 1970 version of this provision, the statute required that the pollutant in question not be included in Section 112(b)(1)(a), that's the list of hazardous air pollutants. This would be consistent with the desire not to double regulate the same pollutant under two different programs. In the 1990 version of the Clean Air Act, this provision was modified to read, a pollutant cannot be regulated under NSPS if the pollutant is emitted from a source category which is regulated under Section 112, that's the hazardous air pollutant program. This means that if the emissions of carbon dioxide come from a source category already covered under the hazardous air pollutant program, then EPA cannot use Section 111 to cover CO2 emissions from that same category. The problem with this modification is that mercury is a hazardous air pollutant regulated under the source category of coal power plants. Since coal power plants are a source category and since mercury is a hazardous air pollutant, this would appear to bar NSPS from regulating the source of coal power plants further. This may sound like a technical snafu, but it was a major legal argument against the Obama Clean Power Plan. This change is not without controversy. The Senate version of the legislation retained the original 1970 language that simply barred double regulating. However, the House version made the change that now presents problems, and it was the version that was codified into law. How about the Prevention of Significant Deterioration program? This will work for those sources already covered in attainment areas, as you'll see from the 2014 case of Utility Air Regulatory Group versus the EPA. But the problem with carbon dioxide emissions is really in non-attainment areas where this ruling will not have an impact. Let's move to hazardous air pollutants. As you can see here, if the pollutant causes adverse human health effects or adverse environmental effects, it might qualify as a hazardous air pollutant. But two things to keep in mind. First, are greenhouse gases like the other hazardous air pollutants, such as benzene? And second, the trigger for inclusion is only 25 tons per year. At a limit of only 25 tons, consider how many tons per year on average many facilities emit of carbon dioxide. It's much, much greater than 25 tons, even for small emitters. Consider how this would impact our economy. Another option for regulating greenhouse gases is the Stratospheric Ozone Protection Program, where the focus of this program is on effects to the upper atmosphere and reducing production and use of certain chemicals. Would this fit well with greenhouse gas emissions coming from so many diverse sources? Finally, there's this obscure provision in the Clean Air Act, Section 115. If an international body finds that the U.S. is emitting an air pollutant which is endangering another country, then the states contributing must address this in their state implementation plan. But Section 115 requires a reciprocal arrangement with the other country. Consider how this might work for a global problem like greenhouse gases. In your assigned reading material, you'll read an article on the Obama administration's Clean Power Plan. The thrust of this legislation, which was never adjudicated on its merits because the Trump administration rescinded it before the courts could issue its ruling, is whether EPA has the authority to impose a shift in electricity generation from coal to something like renewables. The legal argument is whether the technology standard imposed by the NSPS program, which requires a best system of emission reduction, could include shutting down coal plants in favor of cleaner alternatives. Do the words system of emission reduction mean you can require things that might occur outside the physical boundaries of the plant? For example, shutting down a coal plant and building or investing in cleaner alternatives. Is it about absolute emissions or specific facility performance? In June of 2019, the Trump administration took a different approach in its Affordable Clean Energy Rule, where the Clean Power Plan allowed several pathways to achieve its goals. The ACE rule only offered one pathway, that was heat rate efficiency, which is essentially drawing more energy from the same amount of fuel. The Trump administration's rule could result in an increase of fuel usage, which would result in more emissions. One study estimated that almost 30% of the coal plants under ACE would emit more CO2 compared to doing nothing at all. EPA even admitted that the rule would produce extra pollutants and cause between 460 and 1,400 additional deaths by the year 2030.